The summer sun was beating down on the city and the heat was almost unbearable. David wiped the sweat from his forehead as he closed his laptop in his office on the 10th floor of the downtown building. He had been working for 12 hours straight, going through property reports, checking maintenance requests, and reviewing financial statements. At 34 years old, David had built his real estate business from nothing, and now he owned several apartment complexes across the city. But today felt different. The stress was getting to him, and he knew he needed a break. He looked out his office window at the busy street below, watching people hurry past in the heat. Then he remembered something that made him smile. He owned a beautiful apartment complex called Riverside Gardens just 20 minutes away, and it had one of the nicest pools in the area. David had bought Riverside Gardens 3 years ago when it was run down and barely half full. The previous owner had let it fall apart, and most people didn't want to live there. But David saw potential where others saw problems. He spent over $2 million fixing everything. New paint, new floors, updated kitchens, and a completely redesigned pool area that looked like something from a fancy resort. Now the complex was full, with a waiting list of people wanting to move in. The pool area was his pride and joy. He had installed new deck furniture, beautiful landscaping, and even a small snack bar. But the best part was that he rarely got to enjoy it himself. He was always too busy working. Today would be different, he decided. He grabbed his swim bag from the closet in his office, the one he kept there but never seemed to use. Inside were simple black swim shorts, a white tank top, and his laptop bag. If he was going to take a break, he might as well get some light work done by the pool. The drive to Riverside Gardens took him through some of the city's nicest neighborhoods. As he pulled into the complex, he felt that familiar sense of pride. The buildings looked amazing, with fresh paint and well-maintained gardens. The parking lot was clean, and families were walking around, kids playing on the playground he had installed last year. David parked his car and walked toward the pool area. He used his master key card to enter through the gate. The pool area was exactly as he had envisioned it when he first bought the place. Crystal clear water, comfortable lounge chairs, and beautiful palm trees providing shade. There were only a few people there, which was perfect for what he had in mind. He recognized Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who had lived in the complex for 2 years. She was reading a book under an umbrella, and she looked up and smiled when she saw him. There was also the Johnson family, a young couple with a toddler who was splashing happily in the shallow end. They had moved in about 8 months ago and always paid their rent on time. David found a lounge chair in a quiet corner of the pool area, not too far from the water, but not in anyone's way. He set down his bag and pulled out his laptop. The chair was comfortable, and the gentle sound of the pool filter and the occasional splash from the Johnsons' little boy created a peaceful atmosphere he hadn't experienced in months. He opened his laptop and started reviewing some reports from his other properties. But for the first time in weeks, he wasn't feeling stressed about the numbers. The warm sun on his shoulders and the relaxing environment were exactly what he needed. This was why he had worked so hard, he thought. Not just to make money, but to create beautiful spaces where people could live comfortably and safely. As he worked, David occasionally looked up to watch the families enjoying the pool. This was what made all the long hours and difficult decisions worth it. When he first bought Riverside Gardens, the pool was green and dirty, and nobody wanted to use it. Now it was the heart of the community, a place where neighbors met and children played safely. The Johnson family was getting ready to leave, and they waved goodbye to David as they packed up their things. Mrs. Chen had fallen asleep under her umbrella, her book resting on her chest. The pool area was becoming even more peaceful, with just the sound of water and the distant hum of traffic from the street. David closed his eyes for a moment and let himself truly relax. He thought about how far he had come since starting his business. Growing up, his family didn't have much money, and he had worked part-time jobs through college to pay for his education. After graduating, he had saved every penny he could to buy his first small rental property. That first property was nothing like Riverside Gardens. It was a small duplex in a rough neighborhood, and he had to fix everything himself to save money. He learned plumbing, electrical work, and carpentry from YouTube videos and trial and error. There were times when he wondered if he had made a mistake, especially when tenants couldn't pay rent or when something major broke down. But he kept going, and slowly, he was able to buy another property, then another, Each one taught him something new about the business, about dealing with people, and about creating communities that people were proud to call home. Riverside Gardens was his biggest success so far, but he had plans for even bigger projects. As he sat by the pool, David felt grateful for everything he had accomplished. He had created jobs for maintenance workers, provided homes for dozens of families, and turned a neglected property into something beautiful. Not bad for a kid who grew up in a one-bedroom apartment with his single mother. The afternoon was perfect. The temperature was warm but not too hot. There was a gentle breeze, and the pool water looked incredibly inviting. David was actually considering taking a swim when he finished reviewing his reports. When was the last time he had actually gone swimming? He couldn't even remember. He looked around the pool area again, taking in all the details he had personally chosen during the renovation. The blue and white tiles around the pool edge, the comfortable outdoor furniture, the small changing rooms that were always kept clean. Everything was exactly as he had planned it, and seeing people enjoy it made all the hard work worthwhile. David opened his laptop again and started working on a proposal for his next project. But this time, instead of feeling stressed about deadlines and budgets, he felt excited about creating another beautiful community for people to call home. David was deep into his work when he heard the pool gate open with a loud clang. He looked up to see a woman in her early 40s walking briskly toward the pool area, followed by two children who looked to be around 8 and 10 years old. The woman was carrying multiple pool bags and seemed to be in a hurry. He recognized her as Patricia, though he had never spoken to her directly. She had moved into apartment 4B about 6 months ago. David made it a point to learn about his tenants, and he knew she was a single mother who worked in marketing for a big company downtown. Her rental application had shown good credit and steady income, so there had been no issues with approving her lease. Patricia set down her bags near the pool chairs and started pulling out towels, sunscreen, and pool toys for her kids. The children immediately became excited about getting in the water, but Patricia told them to wait while she set everything up properly. David went back to his laptop, trying not to disturb the family's pool time, but something felt off. David noticed that Patricia kept glancing in his direction, and not in a friendly way. Her body language seemed tense, and she was whispering something to her children while looking toward him. The kids seemed confused by whatever she was telling them. After a few minutes, Patricia walked directly toward David's lounge chair. Her expression was serious, and David could tell she was upset about something. He closed his laptop and looked up with a friendly smile, ready to address whatever concern she might have. "Excuse me," Patricia said in a loud voice that seemed designed to get attention from anyone else in the pool area. "This pool is for residents only." David was surprised by her aggressive tone. He had expected maybe a question about pool hours or rules, not an accusation. "Yes, I know that," he replied calmly, keeping his voice friendly despite her hostile approach. Patricia crossed her arms and took a step closer. "Well, I've been living here for months, and I know all the residents who use this pool regularly." "I've never seen you here before." Her voice was getting louder, and David noticed that Mrs. Chen had woken up and was watching the interaction with concern. David felt a familiar, uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. He had experienced situations like this before, where people made assumptions about whether he belonged in certain places. It was always awkward and frustrating, but he had learned to stay calm and handle these situations with dignity. "I don't use the pool very often," David explained, still maintaining a polite tone. "I'm usually too busy with work." But Patricia wasn't satisfied with his answer. In fact, she seemed to become more agitated. "That's exactly what someone would say if they didn't actually live here," she declared. "I pay a lot of money to live in this complex, and the pool is one of the main reasons I chose this place. I won't have unauthorized people sneaking in here." David felt his jaw tighten, but he forced himself to remain calm. Other residents were starting to notice the confrontation. The Wilson family had just arrived at the pool with their teenage daughter, and they stopped near the entrance, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. "Ma'am, I have every right to be here," David said firmly but politely. He didn't want to escalate the situation, especially with children present, but he also wasn't going to be bullied into leaving his own property. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Every right? Based on what? I haven't seen you pay rent or get mail here. I notice these things because I care about the security of our community." She emphasized the word "our," in a way that made it clear she didn't. Consider David part of that community. Mrs. Chen stood up from her chair and started walking toward them. David appreciated her concern, but he hoped the elderly woman wouldn't get involved in what was clearly becoming an unpleasant situation. "Patricia, dear," Mrs. Chen said gently, "perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." But Patricia turned toward Mrs. Chen with irritation. "Mrs. Chen, you're too trusting. People take advantage of communities like ours all the time. They sneak into pools, use our facilities, and some of them are probably looking for opportunities to steal or cause trouble." David felt his heart rate increase. Patricia's words were crossing a line from simple misunderstanding into something much more troubling. He stood up from his chair, his 6-foot frame making him taller than Patricia, but he kept his posture non-threatening and his hands visible. "I think you should be very careful about what you're suggesting," David said quietly, his voice carrying a warning tone despite his controlled demeanor. But Patricia seemed to interpret his standing up as aggressive. "Now you're trying to intimidate me?" she said loudly, causing her own children to look scared and confused. "This is exactly the kind of behavior that proves you don't belong here." The Wilson family was still standing near the pool gate, clearly wanting to use the pool but unwilling to enter while the confrontation was happening. Their teenage daughter had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording the interaction, something that was becoming increasingly common when these types of situations occurred in public. David noticed the phone but didn't say anything about it. He had nothing to hide, and in some ways having a record of the conversation might actually protect him if Patricia continued to escalate her accusations. "Look," David said, trying one more time to de-escalate the situation, "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. Maybe we should start over." But Patricia shook her head firmly. "No, I don't think so. I think you should leave right now, before I have to call security." She pulled her own phone out of her purse and held it up as a threat. David realized that reasoning with Patricia was probably impossible at this point. Her mind was made up about who she thought he was and whether he belonged at the pool. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, being told to leave a property he owned by someone who was paying him rent every month. Mrs. Chen tried again to intervene. "Patricia, I really think you're making a mistake here. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your kindness, but you don't understand how these situations work," Patricia replied dismissively. "People like him count on residents being too polite to question their presence. Well, I'm not going to be taken advantage of." The phrase "people like him" hung in the air like a dark cloud. David felt anger rising in his chest, but he had learned long ago that losing his temper in situations like this would only make things worse. Instead, he took a deep breath and prepared himself for what he knew was coming next. Patricia was already dialing a number on her phone. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly, making sure everyone around the pool could hear her. "We'll see how long you want to stay here once they arrive to check your identification and find out you're trespassing." David sat back down in his chair and reopened his laptop. If Patricia wanted to call the police to his own property, he would wait right there for them to arrive. This conversation was about to become very interesting, though probably not in the way Patricia expected. Patricia held her phone up high, making sure everyone could see that she was serious about calling the authorities. "I'm dialing 911 right now," she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the entire pool area. "We'll see how tough you are when the police get here." David remained seated in his lounge chair, his laptop still open in front of him. He had dealt with difficult tenants before, but this situation was reaching new levels of absurdity. He watched as Patricia's fingers hovered over her phone screen, clearly wanting to make sure she had an audience for her dramatic gesture. "Ma'am, I really don't think you want to do that," David said calmly, though he was beginning to feel less patient with her behavior. "You might want to reconsider your assumptions about who belongs here." But his words only seemed to fuel Patricia's anger. "Are you threatening me now?" she said, her voice rising even higher. "First you trespass on private property, then you try to intimidate residents, and now you're making threats? This just proves I was right about you." Mrs. Chen looked distressed by the escalating confrontation. She tried once more to intervene. "Patricia, please listen. I think you're making a very big mistake." Patricia turned toward the elderly woman with frustration. "Mrs. Chen, I know you mean well, but you're being naive. People like this man prey on communities like ours. They look for nice, safe places with good facilities, and they sneak in whenever they think nobody's watching. The phrase, "people like this man," made David's jaw clench. He had hoped that Patricia would realize her error before taking things too far, but she seemed determined to dig herself into a deeper hole with every word she spoke. By now, more residents had gathered around the pool area. The Wilson family was still standing near the entrance, their teenage daughter continuing to record everything on her phone. Two other families had arrived and were watching the scene unfold with obvious discomfort. David recognized all of them as his tenants, people whose rent checks he deposited every month. "I pay $2,800 a month to live in this complex," Patricia continued, her voice now loud enough that people in nearby apartments could probably hear her through their windows. "I chose this place specifically because it's supposed to be safe and secure. I won't have random people using our facilities just because they think they can get away with it." David almost laughed at the irony. The $2,800 Patricia was so proud of paying was money that went directly to his bank account. She was essentially paying him to own the pool she was now trying to kick him out of. $2,800 is a lot of money, David agreed, his voice still calm despite his growing frustration. "I'm sure your landlord appreciates tenants who pay their rent on time." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Don't try to change the subject. And don't act like you know anything about how rental properties work. If you had a job and could afford to live somewhere like this, you'd understand." The assumption that he was unemployed and couldn't afford to live in his own complex was almost too much for David to handle. He felt his hands ball into fists, but he forced himself to relax. Losing his temper would only give Patricia more ammunition for her false narrative. "I understand more about rental properties than you might think," David replied, keeping his voice steady. Meanwhile, Patricia had started dialing numbers on her phone. "Hello, police," she said loudly, making sure everyone could hear her. "I need to report a trespasser at my apartment complex. There's a man here who doesn't live here, and he's refusing to leave the pool area. He's also making threats toward residents." David shook his head at the exaggeration. He hadn't made any threats, but he knew that Patricia was probably scared and feeling like she needed to justify her actions to the authorities. The Wilsons' teenage daughter, Amy, stepped forward with her phone still recording. "Excuse me, miss," she said to Patricia, "but I don't think you know who you're talking to." Patricia turned toward Amy with irritation. "Young lady, this is an adult situation. You should ask your parents to take you inside until this is resolved." But Amy stood her ground. "Actually, I think you should know that—" "Amy, honey, come back over here," her father called, clearly not wanting his daughter to get involved in the increasingly hostile situation. Patricia continued her phone call with the police. "Yes, he's still here. He's a black man, probably in his 30s, and he's acting very suspicious. He has a laptop with him, which is strange for someone who's supposed to be swimming. I think he might be planning something." David felt his blood pressure rising. Patricia was now not only making false accusations, but also bringing race into her description in a way that was clearly intended to make him seem more threatening to the authorities. This was exactly the kind of behavior that led to dangerous situations for people who looked like him. Mrs. Chen looked horrified by Patricia's phone call. "Patricia, please hang up the phone. You're making a terrible mistake." But Patricia was too committed to her course of action to listen to reason. "The officer says they'll send someone right away," she announced to the crowd. "They take trespassing very seriously in this neighborhood." David pulled out his own phone and started scrolling through his contacts. If Patricia wanted to involve the authorities, he could play that game too. He found the number for James Rodriguez, the head of security for all his properties, and sent him a quick text message asking him to come to Riverside Gardens immediately. "Calling for backup?" Patricia asked sarcastically when she saw David using his phone. "Your friends can't help you now. The police are already on their way." "I'm not calling friends," David replied calmly. "I'm calling someone who can help clear up this misunderstanding before it goes any further." Patricia laughed dismissively. "The only thing that's going to clear up this misunderstanding is when the police check your identification and find out you have no business being here. Then we'll see how confident you are." More residents had gathered around the pool area, drawn by the loud voices and obvious conflict. David could see the discomfort on their faces. This was supposed to be a peaceful, family-friendly community, and Patricia's behavior was disrupting that atmosphere for everyone. "This is really unnecessary," said Mr. Thompson. an older gentleman who lived in Building C. "Maybe we could all just calm down and work this out without involving the police." Patricia turned toward him with exasperation. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate that you want to keep the peace, but sometimes you have to take a stand. If we don't protect our community from people who don't belong here, who will?" David noticed that several residents were now pulling out their phones to record the confrontation. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he knew that whatever happened next would likely end up on social media within hours. "Ma'am," David said, standing up from his chair again, "I'm going to ask you one more time to reconsider what you're doing. You're about to make this situation much worse for yourself." But Patricia interpreted his words as another threat. "Everyone heard that," she shouted. "He's threatening me again. This is exactly why we need security in places like this." David realized that there was no reasoning with Patricia at this point. She had convinced herself that he was a dangerous trespasser, and nothing he said was going to change her mind. All he could do now was wait for the authorities to arrive, and hope that the truth would come out before the situation escalated any further. The tension around the pool was thick enough to cut with a knife. Patricia stood with her phone pressed to her ear, giving the police dispatcher additional details about what she perceived as a dangerous situation. More residents had gathered around, creating a crowd that was clearly making everyone uncomfortable. David remained seated in his lounge chair, occasionally checking his phone for a response from James, his security manager. He could hear sirens in the distance, though they might have been heading to any number of emergencies in the busy city. The whole situation had become surreal. Just as Patricia was finishing her phone call with the police, David heard the familiar beep of the pool gate's electronic lock. James Rodriguez walked through the entrance, his security uniform immediately visible to everyone in the area. At 55 years old, James was a former police officer who had worked security for David's properties for over 2 years. He was respected by all the residents and had an excellent track record of handling difficult situations. "Good afternoon, everyone," James said calmly as he surveyed the scene. His experienced eyes quickly took in the crowd of residents, the obvious tension in the air, and Patricia standing with her phone still in her hand. Patricia immediately turned toward James with relief. "Thank goodness you're here," she said quickly. "I called the police about this man who's trespassing in our pool area. He's been here for over an hour, and he refuses to leave even though he clearly doesn't live here." James looked toward David, and his expression immediately changed to one of concern and confusion. "Mr. Williams, what's going on here?" The moment James said Mr. Williams, a strange quiet fell over the pool area. Patricia's confident expression wavered slightly, as if she had heard something that didn't quite make sense to her. "Hello, James," David replied, standing up from his chair. "I was trying to enjoy a quiet afternoon by the pool when this resident decided I didn't belong here. She's called the police and accused me of trespassing." James looked shocked. "Trespassing? Sir, you own this entire complex." The words hit the crowd like a thunderbolt. Patricia's face went completely white, and her phone nearly slipped from her hand. The other residents began murmuring among themselves, some with surprise, others with what appeared to be embarrassment for Patricia's behavior. "That's impossible," Patricia said weakly, though her voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. "He's too young and he doesn't look like—" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but everyone understood what she had been about to say. David reached into his pool bag and pulled out his wallet. From it, he extracted a business card and held it out toward Patricia. "I'm David Williams, owner of Williams Development Group. I purchased Riverside Gardens 3 years ago and invested over $2 million in renovations." Patricia stared at the business card, as if it might be fake. Her hands were shaking slightly as she read the elegant lettering, "David Williams, CEO, Williams Development Group, specializing in luxury residential properties." Mrs. Chen stepped forward, her elderly face showing a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "Patricia, dear, this is what I was trying to tell you. Mr. Williams is our landlord. He's the one who made this place so beautiful." The Wilson family's teenage daughter, Amy, was still recording everything on her phone. "This is incredible," she whispered to her parents. "She's been yelling at the owner of the building." James looked extremely uncomfortable with the situation. "Ma'am," he said to Patricia, "Mr. Williams is not only the owner of this property, but he's also one of the most respected developers in the city. He's never had any kind of incident or complaint at any of his properties. Patricia's face was cycling through several different emotions: shock, embarrassment, and what appeared to be growing panic as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. "But I've never seen him here before," she said weakly, as if that somehow justified her behavior. "That's because I'm usually working," David explained calmly. "I spend most of my time in my office downtown managing my properties. Today was one of the rare occasions when I decided to take a break and enjoy the pool area that I designed and paid for." Mr. Thompson, the older gentleman who had tried to mediate earlier, stepped forward. "Patricia, perhaps you should apologize to Mr. Williams. This has clearly been a misunderstanding." But Patricia seemed frozen, unable to process what was happening. She looked around at the crowd of residents, many of whom were now looking at her with obvious disapproval. Some were shaking their heads, others were whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. "I was just trying to protect our community," Patricia said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing the right thing." David could see that Patricia was genuinely shocked by the revelation, but he was also deeply troubled by the assumptions she had made about him. "Ms. Patterson," he said, using her last name to maintain some formality, "protecting a community doesn't mean making assumptions about people based on how they look or whether you think they belong somewhere." James pulled out his own phone. "Mr. Williams, should I call the police back and let them know the situation has been resolved?" Before David could answer, they all heard the sound of police sirens getting closer. Within moments, 2 police officers entered the pool area, their presence immediately commanding attention from everyone present. "We received a call about a trespassing situation," one of the officers said, looking around at the crowd of people. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. The confidence and righteous anger she had displayed earlier were completely gone, replaced by obvious mortification at the situation she had created. James stepped forward to address the officers. "Officers, I'm James Rodriguez, head of security for this property. There's been a misunderstanding. The person who was reported as trespassing is actually David Williams, the owner of the entire complex." The police officers looked confused. "The owner?" David walked over to the officers and showed them his identification and business card. "Yes, officers. I own this property through Williams Development Group. The resident who called you was mistaken about my right to be here." One of the officers, a woman in her 40s, looked at Patricia with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Ma'am, did you realize you were calling the police on your own landlord?" Patricia could only shake her head, tears starting to form in her eyes. The reality of what she had done was finally sinking in completely. The other residents were now looking at Patricia with a mixture of pity and disapproval. They had witnessed her make accusations based on nothing more than her assumptions about David's appearance and whether he looked like someone who belonged in their upscale community. David felt a mixture of anger and sadness about the whole situation. He had worked hard to create a welcoming community at Riverside Gardens, and seeing one of his tenants display such prejudice was deeply disappointing. "Officers," David said calmly, "I don't want to press any charges. This was a misunderstanding, though a very unfortunate one." The police officers nodded and began to leave, but not before one of them spoke quietly to Patricia about the seriousness of making false reports. Their departure left the pool area in an uncomfortable silence, with everyone trying to process what had just happened. After the police officers left, an uncomfortable silence settled over the pool area. Patricia stood frozen in place, her face red with embarrassment and her hands still trembling. The crowd of residents remained, but the energy had completely shifted from curiosity to awkwardness and disapproval. David sat back down in his lounge chair, but he knew his peaceful afternoon was over. The confrontation had drained him emotionally, and he could feel the familiar exhaustion that came from dealing with situations like this. He had hoped that by creating beautiful, welcoming communities, he could avoid some of the prejudice he had experienced throughout his life. Today proved that assumption wrong. Mrs. Chen was the first person to break the silence. She walked slowly over to David, her face showing genuine sorrow about what had happened. "Mr. Williams, I am so sorry about this. Patricia's behavior was completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that not all of us feel that way." David stood up and gave the elderly woman a gentle smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. I appreciate your kindness, and I know you tried to stop this before it went too far." One by one, other residents began approaching David to apologize for Patricia's behavior. The Wilson family came over with their daughter Amy still holding her phone. "Mr. Williams," said Mr. Wilson, "I'm embarrassed that this happened in our community. Thank you for everything you've done to make this place so nice for our families." Their daughter Amy looked up at David with admiration. "I recorded the whole thing," she said. "I can't believe she treated you like that. You own this place and you've made it amazing for everyone." David appreciated the support, but he was concerned about the video. "Amy, I hope you'll be thoughtful about what you do with that recording. While I appreciate you documenting what happened, I don't want this to become something that causes more problems for anyone." But Amy was already showing the video to her parents. "Dad, this is going to go viral. People need to see how wrong she was." Mr. Thompson, the older gentleman who had tried to mediate during the confrontation, approached David with obvious regret. "Sir, I should have spoken up more strongly when I heard what she was saying. I could see this was wrong, but I didn't want to get involved." "I'm sorry about that." David shook the man's hand. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate that you tried to help. These situations are difficult for everyone." Meanwhile, Patricia remained standing in the same spot, apparently unable to move or speak. Her two children, who had been playing quietly in the shallow end of the pool during the whole confrontation, were now looking at their mother with confusion and concern. James, the security manager, walked over to David with a serious expression. "Sir, I need to ask what you want me to do about this situation. We have clear policies about residents harassing other tenants, but this is obviously a unique circumstance." David looked over at Patricia, who was now crying quietly while her children tried to comfort her. Despite his anger about her behavior, he felt some sympathy for her embarrassment. "Let me think about it, James. This isn't a decision I want to make while emotions are running high." As word of the incident spread around the pool area, more residents began coming outside to see what was happening. David realized that the story would probably be all over the complex within hours, and Patricia would have to face the consequences of her actions every time she left her apartment. Amy Wilson was already posting the video on social media. "I'm putting this on TikTok and Instagram," she announced. "People need to see this." Within minutes of Amy posting the video, her phone started buzzing with notifications. The video was being shared rapidly, and comments were pouring in from viewers who were shocked by Patricia's behavior. "Oh my God," Amy said, staring at her phone. "This already has 1,000 views and it's only been online for 5 minutes. David felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He had hoped to handle this situation quietly, but now it was spiraling beyond his control. Social media had a way of turning local incidents into national news stories, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that level of attention. Patricia seemed to realize what was happening when she heard Amy talking about the video going viral. She walked over to David with tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Williams," she said quietly, "I am so sorry. I made a terrible mistake, and I know there's probably nothing I can say to fix this. I was wrong about everything, and I'm ashamed of my behavior." David looked at Patricia carefully, trying to determine if her apology was genuine or if she was just afraid of the consequences she was facing. Her tears seemed real, and he could see genuine remorse in her eyes. "Patricia, I appreciate your apology," David said calmly, "but I have to ask you to think about why you made the assumptions you did. This wasn't just a simple mistake. You saw me using this pool and immediately decided I didn't belong here, even though you had no evidence to support that conclusion." Patricia nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue that Mrs. Chen had given her. "You're right. I made assumptions based on things that I know are wrong. I was raised better than that, and I don't know why I acted that way." David could see that Patricia was struggling to articulate what had motivated her behavior, and he decided not to push her further in front of the crowd. "I think this is a conversation we should continue privately," he said. By now, Amy's video had been viewed thousands of times and was being shared across multiple social media platforms. The comments were overwhelmingly critical of Patricia's behavior, with many people expressing outrage at her treatment of David. "This is crazy," Amy said, reading comments on her phone. "People are sharing this everywhere. Someone already made a meme about it." David realized that the incident was going to have consequences far beyond what happened at the pool that day. Patricia's behavior had been recorded and was now being seen by people all over the world. Her reputation would likely be damaged permanently, and she might even face consequences at her job if her employer saw the video. James came back over to David with an update. "Sir, I've been getting calls from local news stations. Word about this incident is spreading quickly, and reporters want to interview you about what happened." David shook his head. "I'm not interested in talking to the media about this. I just want to move forward and focus on maintaining a positive community here." As the afternoon went on, more residents came to the pool area to express their support for David and their disappointment in Patricia's behavior. The incident had clearly shaken the community, and people were taking sides. Patricia eventually gathered her children and left the pool area, but not before approaching David one more time. "Mr. Williams," she said quietly, "I know you probably want me to move out after what happened today. I understand if that's what you decide." David considered her words carefully. He was angry about her behavior, but he also believed in giving people opportunities to learn from their mistakes. "Patricia, I'm not making any decisions about your lease today, but I do think we need to have a serious conversation about how to move forward." 2 weeks later, Patricia quietly moved out of Riverside Gardens. The viral video had indeed affected her job, and she had received numerous negative messages from people who had seen her behavior online. She left a letter for David apologizing again and acknowledging that she needed to examine her own prejudices. David used the incident as an opportunity to organize community meetings about diversity and inclusion. He invited speakers to talk about unconscious bias and how communities could work together to ensure everyone felt welcome and respected. The pool area returned to its peaceful atmosphere, but the incident served as a reminder that even in the most beautiful communities, people needed to continuously work on treating each other with dignity and respect. David continued to enjoy occasional afternoons by the pool, and residents always made sure to greet him warmly when they saw him there.